The vaulted chamber of the Concordium Shard had been designed to humble, a feat of impossible architecture suspended in a sphere of glacial light. Its curved walls were inlaid with the polished bones of extinct leviathans, each rib arching over. A dais large enough to host an empire's worth of arrogance. Beneath that cold magnificence, 100 dignitaries watched the humans stand. No words were spoken. No further arguments offered. The envoys in matte black exo-armor simply rose from the crescent table and turned their backs on the assembly. Their boots struck the ancient floor with a resonance that shivered across every channel. Each step a punctuation mark that declared the talks were over. An old Kelturi archivist would later insist that he felt the air itself recoil. Galaxy did not yet know it, but in that moment, those dozen quiet footfalls, it had stepped onto the hinge of history. The tall windows of the chamber looked out on the night-flung stars, and for an instant, it seemed the constellations themselves flickered, as if uncertain whether to keep shining. For cycles uncounted, the Keltari Imperium had dictated the fate of lesser worlds. Their emissaries had spread their offers terms, dressed up as diplomacy, but in truth, little more than conquest softened by ritual. 1,000 species had signed their charters, delivered tribute, and lowered their eyes in gratitude that the Imperium permitted them continued existence. The Concordium was supposed to be the crowning testament to this grand arrangement, a place of negotiation that was, in fact, a throne room in all but name. And Earth, this upstart world on the ragged edge of the Orion Spur, was supposed to be just another name added to the list of compliant tributaries. Humanity's representatives had been summoned to this place as a courtesy, or so the Kelturi claimed. In truth, it was theater. The demands were already set in place. 90% of Sol's resources tithed to the Imperium, control of all. Slipstream access ceded to Kelturi Command, and a permanent garrison to ensure cultural guidance. It was the same ultimatum offered to dozens of worlds before, and the Keltari had come to expect the same cycle: protests, capitulations, then centuries of orderly servitude. But the humans had not followed the script. They had listened in total silence as the Keltari High Arbiters recited the terms. Not once did any envoy interrupt. They did not lean forward or betray any flicker of desperation. Some among the assembly mistook this for shock. Others assumed it was ignorance, a simple species too backward to comprehend the weight of the bargain before them. And when the readings came in verifying the humans' lack of a formal interstellar fleet or deep crust, war foundries most believed the outcome was assured. And yet, as the 12 envoys walked away, something deeper than protocol seemed to tremble in the chamber's foundation. Some would later swear that the black visors turned fractionally, as if each helmet concealed a smile. Even the Keltari high strategists, beings bred to be immune to superstition, felt an unbidden discomfort that pulsed in the mind like a slow forming THUNDEA, HEAD. It was the way they left, without any final entreaty or flourish, that planted the first seed of disquiet. Because to refuse the Imperium's terms outright was unthinkable. To decline them with such a casual finality was something worse. It suggested certainty. And certainty, in the annals of galactic conquest, was often a prelude to catastrophe. After the chamber doors sealed themselves behind the departing humans, silence reigned. No one moved to break it. The old archivist's stylus hovered useless above his etched plates. A Korathi diplomat reached for a goblet with a trembling claw. Even the high arbiters of the Imperium paused, gazing out across the darkness where the human shuttle would be rising back to orbit. Admiral Zeruth retained the presence of mind to gesture for the chamber's hollow recordings to be archived. She had fought 100 campaigns in the Imperium's name and learned that small anomalies were the first markers of history's fractures. She did not know yet what form this fracture would take, whether rebellion, sabotage, or something stranger, but she knew the Keltari had missed something vital in their calculations. For all the Imperium's power, for all its conquests and Trophies, they had forgotten an old lesson, that a civilization does not simply walk away from a negotiation unless it already possesses something it values more than peace. Zeruth turned to the lead arbitrator, her voice low. Begin reassessment of all intelligence profiles. Full spectrum. I want to know what we overlooked. But even as her command rippled outward, she could not shake the quiet dread that had begun to pool in her chest. It was like watching a storm roll over a horizon you thought was clear, and on 1,000 worlds across the Concordium's reach, other envoys and observers began to ask the same question, the one no one had prepared to answer. If the humans would not accept peace on any terms, what were they prepared to do instead? Asterisk, the Keltari Imperium did not waste time. Even before the human envoy's shuttle reached low orbit, Admiral Zeruth's fleet was on the move. From hidden anchorages scattered across the nearest systems, vast carriers and battleships ignited, their drives streaming toward Sol under classified invasion protocols. In the command echelons of the Concordium, their mobilization was treated as a grim but inevitable precaution, a show of force meant to intimidate the obstinate species back to the negotiating table. After all, this was what had always worked before, a reminder cold, overwhelming, inarguable, that the Imperium's patience was measured in hours, not years, that the cost of defiance was extinction or worse. And yet, as the fleets advanced, a strange pattern began to emerge. It started small. A scout corvette dispatched to establish an orbital relay around Neptune transmitted an incomplete scan before vanishing without alarm. The vessel's last record was an innocuous status ping, but all attempts to re-establish contact failed. An accident, the strategist said. A micrometeorite impact, a systems failure. There was no indication the humans even possessed ships capable of interdicting a corvette. Then, as the main flotilla reached the edge of Jupiter's orbit, their long-range comm arrays began to register phantom signals, encrypted bursts that defied decryption, shadows in the void flickering just beyond sensor resolution. Some of these signals seemed to be nothing but random data noise, but they kept repeating in precise intervals, too regular to be coincidence. Fleet Command's analysts worked through the rotations, feeding every scrap of telemetry into the predictive engines. Still, no satisfactory explanation arose. Humanity had been categorized as a Category 3 civilization, technologically precocious, but fragmented and poorly industrialized compared to the galactic standard. They could not possibly have deployed a network of stealth assets or established a quantum interference web. And yet, each time a destroyer made a sensor sweep, the same pattern, echoes of something moving where nothing should be. It was in the midst of this confusion that the Keltari prepared their psychological operations campaign. A series of high-frequency broadcasts in every human language, declaring the Imperium's magnanimous willingness to reopen negotiations. These transmissions were designed to saturate all known communications bands, an overwhelming chorus of authority and threat that no prior subject species had ever ignored. The humans ignored them. Not a single signal was acknowledged. No diplomatic channels reopened. The global infrastructure of Earth remained dark, as if the entire planet had simply ceased listening. Some strategists insisted this was an admission of fear that the humans were paralyzed. Others were less sure. A week into the advance, the first proper intelligence packets returned from hidden reconnaissance drones seated in Sol's orbit. What they reported set off the first real alarms. Over the main continents of Earth, vast regions had gone dark, their electromagnetic signatures collapsing in ways inconsistent with panic. Civilian power grids had not failed, they had been shut down deliberately, methodically, as though a plan were unfolding in precise stages. Observers noted the sudden absence of civilian air traffic and the complete blackout of every known civilian network. The analysts tried to model this as mass retreat or social collapse. But the more they studied it, the clearer it became. This was no collapse. This was preparation. On the 5th day, a Kultari infiltration team inserted into the outskirts of a Magacity New Santiago transmitted only a single, fragmentary report before being cut off. They are not panicking. They are assembling. Then, nothing. In the flotilla's flagship, the Voresk Ultima, Admiral Zeruth stood in the primary observatory deck, staring out across the gas giant that filled half the viewport. Saturn's rings were pale, luminous strata, a reminder of how insignificant a single planet could appear from this vantage. Yet she felt the pressure mounting around her like a storm cell tightening. If the humans were assembling, if they were coordinating this silence, what else might they be hiding? Another transmission arrived hours later, this one a compressed burst from a stealth drone in Earth's high atmosphere. It contained a sequence of visual captures, black columns of armored vehicles moving in convoy across deserted highways, vast rail lines delivering canisters marked with hazard glyphs, thousands of personnel in exosuits systematically dismantling. Orbital communications hubs. Each image radiated a singular unsettling theme: purpose. Humanity was not panicking. Humanity was getting ready. A flurry of urgent conferences erupted among the Kultari command councils. Some argued this was the last desperate theater of a doomed people. Others insisted the data was incomplete, that their own projection models would ultimately prove correct. Yet doubt began to creep through even the most confident voices. In all prior campaigns, there had been signals of capitulation, a steady uptick in surrender appeals, a dissolving of local authority, or a frantic surge in negotiations. Here, there was only the unbroken silence of a civilization that refused to acknowledge defeat, even when defeat was inevitable. And when a Kultari tactical overseer attempted a close proximity scan of the Earth's poles, the probe returned. A final broadcast before its carrier array melted from an unknown interference. You were warned. No encryption, no flourish. Just those 3 words. In the command center of the Voresk Ultima, the Admiral's advisors began to murmur what no one wanted to say aloud. Something about this was wrong in ways no doctrine or historical precedent could explain. And as the last signal faded, it became impossible to dismiss the growing certainty that the Imperium's assumptions about humanity were about to collapse. Asterisk. The moment the first major twist revealed itself, it did so not with a blaze of weapon fire or the roar of massed engines, but in an almost anticlimactic flicker, so subtle that the bridge crew of the Voresk Ultima thought it a sensor calibration fault. An orbital relay one of the Imperium's own, deployed to triangulate surface signatures, suddenly shifted in its telemetry by a fraction of a degree. Its beacon fell out of sync with the command net, blinking from the status green to a muted amber. Then, without warning, every remaining relay in high orbit mirrored the anomaly. For a moment, no one spoke. The relay grid was the bedrock of the Kultari fleet's targeting network. Without it, no ship could track ground targets with precision. No fleet formations could coordinate their orbital descent. No siege bombardments could be safely initiated. Zeruth stepped forward slowly, her 4 hands clasped behind her back. "Report," she ordered, her voice flat. "Admiral," the sensor chief said, fighting to keep her spines from shivering with dread. "The entire grid appears to have moved. We're recalibrating, but the recalibration failed." Again and again, each time they tried to reset the array, the same impossible result returned. The orbital relays were no longer where they had been, and none of them could be reached by normal commands. It took nearly an hour of feverish cross-referencing before the truth emerged, one so outlandish that several strategists refused to believe it outright. The relays had not malfunctioned. They had been stolen. Zeruth read the compiled data twice, unable to deny the pattern. The relays were intact, functional, and fully operational, just no longer under Kultari control. Someone had seized them, reprogrammed their recognition codes, and locked the Imperium out of its own network. The reality hit with the slow, inexorable weight of a planet falling. The humans had been planning for this contingency long before any diplomat ever stepped into the Concordium Shard. Estimate on the method? Zeruth demanded. The chief analyst answered in a hoarse whisper. Unknown, Admiral. It would require infiltration of every node in advance years of preparation, minimum, and total familiarity with Imperium architecture. In other words, impossible. And yet it had been done. Panic began to ripple along the command channels as Keltari captains realized their targeting systems were now useless. Orbital dominance, a pillar of Imperium doctrine, had evaporated in a single, bloodless instant dot in the confusion. A dozen auxiliary craft attempted to re-establish line-of-sight uplinks by maneuvering closer to Earth's surface. That was when the humans revealed the second part of their hidden strategy. At precisely 0400 our Sol standard, hundreds of signals bloomed in Earth's upper stratosphere. At first, they registered as debris fields, unremarkable, inert. But as the scout ships approached, the debris clouds flickered to life. Long dormant satellites unfolded segmented panels, revealing smooth, black housings beneath kinetic kill platforms. Each was no larger than a cargo container, a relic of Earth's obsolete defense programs. The Imperium had never bothered to catalog. Every Keltari ship that ventured near was met with an eruption of tungsten rods accelerated to orbital velocities, silent, unstoppable spears that tore through hull plating as though it were paper. In less than 20 minutes, the Keltari lost 14 auxiliary ships and 3 corvettes. One captain managed a final transmission before his vessel disintegrated. This is no bluff. They planned for orbital interdiction. With a signal cut out in a burst of static, Zeruth felt her breath catch in her throat. That single line carried implications her entire staff was only beginning to grasp. Orbital interdiction was no defensive gesture, it was a declaration. A civilization that prepared to intercept and cripple the Imperium's navy was not expecting to be conquered. It was expecting to fight, and perhaps even to win. The Admiral turned to her tactical overseer, her voice icy. Compile a complete register of Sol's orbital assets. Every satellite, every debris cluster, every signal. I want them mapped. The overseer did not move. His 4 eyes were fixed on his console, where a single line of human code now scrolled. Across every screen, Project Cataclysm engaged. You were warned, Admiral, he whispered. They've breached our secure network. Our own relays are broadcasting this. For the first time in her long service, Zeruth felt the sensation of her limbs weakening under her. A slow, creeping horror replaced the confidence she had once taken for granted. She had seen Keltari fleets reduced to ruin by hubris before, but never her own. The humans had done something no civilization had dared in centuries, turned the Imperium's doctrine against itself. The next hours were a study in disintegration. As her command staff scrambled to establish new fallback networks, more evidence of human infiltration emerged. Encrypted channels used exclusively for high command orders began to broadcast ghost signals, hollow repetitions of outdated orders. Mixed with incomprehensible streams of Earth languages, a single concept kept resurfacing, a phrase that repeated in a dozen tongues. Do not mistake silence for surrender. Zeruth clenched her hands to keep them from trembling. She had believed the humans were simply naive, too young and too proud to understand their place in the galaxy. She understood now that they were not naive. They were deliberate, patient, and utterly unwilling to kneel. In the hours that followed, as the Imperium's fleet drifted in confused disarray, a final transmission arrived, a direct signal aimed at the flagship's primary array. It was a simple message, unadorned by threat or ultimatum. We decline to be ruled. Zeruth stared at it, unable to look away. For the first time in her career, she whispered the words no one else dared. We have made a grave mistake. In the shadowed strategy hall of the Verask Ultima, the hollow projectors still flickered with maps that no longer held meaning. Dozens of fleet formations pulsed on the tactical grid, icons blinking in disarray. The once pristine layers of command structure were dissolving under the weight of a reality no Keltari doctrine had prepared for, that the humans had not only anticipated an invasion, they had rehearsed its collapse. Across the bridge, officers spoke in clipped, frantic voices. Their spines bowed over consoles that spat error messages and jumbled telemetry. Every attempt to re-establish orbital targeting was met by the same quiet, infuriating response. Access denied. Zeruth paced the perimeter of the chamber, her thoughts moving faster than any of her advisors could speak. They had to adapt. They were still the Imperium. Their industrial reserves dwarfed Earth's. Their troop transports carried legions bred for conquest. Surely overwhelming force could still bring this defiant species to heel. Prepare all drop vessels, she ordered, her voice sharp enough to silence the chamber. Manual descent protocols. If we cannot hold the orbitals, we will control the ground. Her overseers saluted as one. Hundreds of transport hulls shifted position across the fleet, their engines igniting in slow, deliberate arcs toward Earth's atmosphere. In the old campaigns, this would have been the final act, the unopposed landing of armored legions to crush resistance before it could coalesce. But as the first waves crossed the Karman line, the humans revealed yet another layer of their defiance. Sensors registered thousands of new heat blooms across Earth's continent's massive power surges, erupting from facilities buried deep beneath mountains and cities. From the American Midwest, the Siberian Plateau, to the crags of the Andes, enormous doors slid open in the ground. From these vaults, vehicles rose into the night sky, not the primitive atmospheric craft the Imperium expected, but sleek black. Forms bristling with angular armor, propulsion arrays pulsing with faint blue coronas. They climbed with impossible acceleration, ignoring the drop trajectories of the Keltari transports, bypassing them as if they were irrelevant. What are those? The tactical overseer hissed, unable to keep the awe from his voice. Zeruth watched. The grainy sensor feeds, her throat dry. Show me the closest intercept. The holodisplay refocused on the leading wedge of human craft. They were no mere interceptors. Each hull was massed and broad, layered in anti-radiation plating and latticework. Radiators. Along the fuselage, dozens of ports were opening, exposing racks of gleaming rods, the same kinetic weapons that had annihilated the Imperium's reconnaissance ships. Except this time, they were not in defensive orbit. They were ascending deliberately, hunting for targets. On the fleet's channels, the alarms began to howl. "Admiral," an officer shouted, "they're engaging. All transports are taking fire." And the holodisplay flared white as the humans launched the first salvos. It was beautiful in a terrible way, those tungsten lances slashing through the upper atmosphere, shedding incandescent trails as they struck the descending Keltari ships. Hundreds of impacts in the span of minutes. Transports split open like ripened fruit, their cargo raining into the stratosphere in burning arcs. Where the Imperium had planned a slow, orderly landing, they now found only chaos. Those transports that survived impact found their navigation jammed by human electronic warfare, forced into shallow, uncontrolled descents. Many detonated against mountain ranges or fell into oceans, leaving nothing but rising plumes of water and debris. Zeruth's hands curled into fists. Divert remaining transports to fallback vectors. Redeploy the battle line, screen our descent. But even as she spoke, more signals emerged from the Earth's surface. New launches. Hundreds. More. And buried within the confusion, a subtler threat unfolded. A coordinated cyber assault on the Imperium's fleet-wide command net. The humans had moved past the orbital relays. They were inside the Imperium's warfighting infrastructure itself. Communications fragmented into a babble of conflicting orders. Friend or foe transponders blinked unpredictably. Fire control systems reset in the middle of targeting cycles. In some cases, entire ships reported damage that did not exist. False telemetry injected to cripple response. Lock out external comms. Zeruth ordered, fighting to keep her voice calm. Purge all signal pathways, too late, on the main. Display, the entire left flank of the Imperium battle line, shifted course in perfect unison. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like a tactical maneuver. But Zeruth saw the pattern instantly. The ships were realigning their vector to place themselves in direct collision with the rest of the fleet. Before she could override, 2 heavy cruisers rammed their sister vessels amidships. Explosions shivered through the darkness, briefly illuminating Earth's horizon in a curtain of white light. The humans had done the unthinkable. They had transformed the Imperium's own numerical advantage into a liability. With every moment, the message became clearer. The Imperium had always believed that superior mass would overwhelm any defense. But humanity did not intend to defend in the conventional sense. They would not meet the Imperium in static lines, nor waste strength. In desperate frontal resistance, they would outthink them, outmaneuver them, strip them of cohesion, and grind them into ruin with the quiet certainty of a civilization that had studied every empire's arrogance and learned how to break it. The remaining Keltari ships attempted to regroup, but the humans were already repositioning. Their black-armored craft split apart into smaller strike groups, accelerating into the weakened flanks, their kinetic weapons firing in perfectly synchronized salvos. More Imperium vessels began to tumble into the atmosphere in flaming wreckage. Zeruth knew then beyond any rationalization that they were facing an adversary who had never been naive at all. The humans had simply been waiting for the moment when the Imperium would commit itself fully to aggression, when retreat would be impossible and the balance of initiative would pass irrevocably to Earth. In her heart, she felt the first chill of desperation. And yet, a smaller, stubborn voice insisted the Imperium still held one truth in its favor. If they could stabilize their formations, if they could land even a fraction of their troops, they might yet salvage victory from this nightmare. But as she stared at the ragged remains of her fleet, a second realization arrived, bleak and undeniable. Even in this hour, the humans had not yet shown everything they were capable of. Zeruth tried to convince herself that what remained of the fleet was enough, that the Imperium's discipline would prevail where their technology had failed. But she had seen enough campaigns unravel to recognize the signs: the frantic voice traffic, the breakdown of hierarchy, the slow corrosion of certainty itself. Aboard the Varask Ultima, the lights flickered as the human cyber intrusions continued to burrow deeper, and a hush began to creep through the command decks. Every officer seemed to sense the same thing, that the humans were not improvising these attacks. They were enacting a design woven decades before the Keltari had ever spoken the word. Earth, she leaned over the tactical table and spoke in a voice that felt brittle in her throat. Recall all remaining transports. Concentrate every cruiser and battleship into a consolidated sphere. We will attempt planetary siege protocols. Admiral, with respect, the overseer began. Do it. He fell silent and relayed the orders. Across the battered orbital layers, Keltari ships pivoted away from their broken dispersal patterns. Plasma plumes lit the darkness as they converged into a single defensive bastion, hulls overlapping to present a solid wall of mass drivers and countermeasures. It was a formation designed to withstand even the fiercest enemy charges. Shielded citadel that had humbled dozens of lesser civilizations, and for the first precious minutes, it seemed to work. The ragged lines stabilized. Communications reasserted themselves, albeit patchily. The humans' kinetic barrages no longer found lone, drifting targets but struck armor dense enough to absorb the impacts. A measure of confidence crept back into the air. Maybe, Zeruth thought, This was where the human's cunning would meet the immovable stone of Imperium strength. Then, with no warning, every sensor feed went black. The holodisplay turned to static. Comms went silent. Even the bridge's artificial lighting died, plunging the chamber into darkness broken only by the emergency strips along the deck plates. A scraping, unsteady silence settled in the gloom. Power loss? Someone whispered. Zeruth was about to answer when the main screen flared to life, unbidden, casting every face in blue pallor. But there was no tactical overlay, no status report. Only a single transmission, repeating in perfect, unhurried cadence. Signal. Authenticated. Project Cataclysm Phase 2 engaged. Zeruth's heart stuttered. She had assumed the orbital sabotage was the extent of the human's preparation. She had not accounted for anything called Phase 2. Reboot all systems, she barked, her voice raw. Purge all code, a flicker. A ripple of motion on the screen. The static parted like a curtain, revealing not a schematic but a live transmission, an image from Earth itself. On the feed, a chamber stretched out under floodlights. Colossal cylinders lay dormant on cradle. Mounts, each one taller than the bridge of the Verask Ultima. Technicians in pressure suits moved among them with methodical precision. Some part of her mind tried to dismiss the sight as a bluff. Another attempt at intimidation. Then she recognized the configuration of the weapons. SI/hypermass. Penetrators. Planet-killers. The kind the Imperium had outlawed even in its worst campaigns. Each cylinder was a dense rod of depleted uranium alloy, fitted with gravity well projectors to accelerate it to a fraction of light speed. Nothing built by the Keltari or anyone else could survive a direct strike. The humans hadn't just prepared for defense. They had prepared for annihilation. A voice accompanied the feed. Calm. Human. No malice in the tone, only a statement of fact. You will depart this system, immediately. Zeruth could not look away from the array of weapons, each one primed to render her fleet and half the planet beneath it into vapor. Admiral, her overseer whispered, these devices, they are genuine. Impossible, another officer rasped. No civilization under quarantine could have manufactured, the voice returned, as if it had heard them. Should you persist in orbit, these will be fired. This is not a negotiation. Someone in the dark began to sob. Zeruth forced herself to stand straighter, to project the confidence she no longer felt. But then the feed shifted again, showing not the weapons but the faces of those who stood ready to arm them. She had expected to see Earth's military officers, hardened tacticians, perhaps, or politicians issuing threats they scarcely comprehended. Instead, she saw miners, engineers, technicians. Civilians. They had come of their own will to oversee the final deterrent, knowing that if it were used, they would perish alongside their attackers. That was the second twist, more terrible than any weapon. The realization settled over her like a funeral shroud. Humanity was not united merely by desperation, or ideology, or the dream of survival. They were united by a conviction so absolute that no threat, no horror could make them submit. They would rather burn their own world than be conquered. The room fell silent but for the soft, unsteady breathing of her officers. One by one, the icons on the holodisplay flickered back to life. The Keltari fleet rendered in harsh red outlines, a reminder that every ship hung suspended above the earth, at the mercy of a civilization that had long since decided the price of freedom. Zeruth had heard 1,000 cultures proclaim they would never bow, but she had never believed it until this moment. And as she met the stares of her terrified sub-commanders, she knew with a cold certainty what they all felt in their marrow. They had ignited a war they could never win. Zeruth had always believed herself immune to fear. She had overseen campaigns that left worlds smoking and civilizations extinguished in a single generation. She had stared down rebel chieftains and watched them crumble under the knowledge that resistance was hopeless. She had been the apex predator in every war she had waged, but as she looked across the command deck, at the horror etched into the faces of her officers, she knew they were all seeing the same vision: annihilation beyond any doctrine or countermeasure. One by one, her ships began transmitting urgent requests for instruction, their captains demanding to know whether the threat was real, whether the Imperium was prepared to test the humans' resolve, whether they were prepared to gamble everything. For a moment, Zeruth almost gave the order to retreat. She could taste it in her throat, a bitter, humiliating admission that the Imperium had overreached, that the humans had outplayed them in every dimension of war. But then the Admiral's old instincts reasserted themselves, clawing their way through her dread. To retreat now would be to concede that humans were her equals, perhaps even her betters. And so she took a long, steadying breath and spoke into the silence. Engage planetary siege protocols. All weapons. We will force their surrender before these weapons can be deployed. It was the last gamble left to her, a swift, overwhelming bombardment to shatter Earth's remaining infrastructure and kill the crews. Preparing those cataclysmic strikes, her fleet obeyed. The consolidated formation shifted again, turrets rolling, to target Earth's launch silos and population centers. Battleships powered up plasma lances capable of scarring continents. Cruisers locked targeting solutions onto deep bunkers, hidden in the bedrock. In the void, between the blue planet and the Armada, the humans' black armored strike craft drifted like vultures, waiting. For a moment, no one moved. No shot was fired. Then, the first lance erupted from a Keltari dreadnought, a column of superheated energy streaking toward the surface. It struck the rim of a mountain, vaporizing stone in a white flash. And in that instant, humanity's patience came to an end. The armored craft ignited their drives, vectoring straight into the heart of the Imperium formation. They did not maneuver cautiously, did not conserve momentum. They accelerated as if no return was planned. The Keltari turrets reoriented frantically, trying to track the swarming shapes. They fired plasma bursts that lit the darkness in emerald arcs. But the humans had never intended a fair engagement. As the first squadron closed range, their hulls split open. Swarms of micro-drones poured out, millions of them, each no bigger than a child's toy, but carrying enough shaped charges to breach a warship's plating. They streaked toward Keltari hulls like a living cloud. Within seconds, the Imperium's defensive gunnery was overwhelmed. Explosions rippled across cruiser hulls. External sensors vanished in plumes of debris. A Keltari destroyer tried to roll out of the formation, venting atmosphere from half a dozen breaches. But the moment it exposed its flank, a human strike craft closed and fired a kinetic rod that punched clean through the midsection. Zeruth clenched the railing as the impact tore her ship from the tactical network, another icon winking out in the sea of red. "Keep firing," she screamed, though her voice was lost in the cacophony of alarms. More lances fired down onto Earth, but now the targeting was erratic. Systems were failing faster than they could be rebooted. And then, as though the humans had choreographed it to a single heartbeat, the hypermass penetrators launched. Every surviving Keltari ship registered the heat blooms from Earth's surface. The sensors that remained operational tracked the climb of 9 projectiles, each the size of a skyscraper, each accelerating past escape velocity with effortless precision. Zeruth knew what came next. No kinetic shield could stop a rod moving at that velocity. No evasive maneuver mattered at such ranges. "All ships," she rasped, "disperse. Scatter trajectories. Do not wait for orders." But the words were too late, or perhaps had never mattered. The rods struck in a staggered series of detonations that turned the orbital night into day. One after another, Keltari battleships vanished in expanding fireballs as the rods split them. Like wet wood, The Varask Ultima reeled under a shockwave so intense it cracked bulkheads and hurled officers across the deck. In those final, strabbing moments, Zeruth saw the unfiltered feed from the exterior hull cameras, the last human strike. Craft drifting close enough that their pilots' faces could be glimpsed through armored visors. They were not triumphant. They were resolute. This was no conquest. No vengeance. It was a simple truth. Enforced without hesitation. Humanity would not kneel. Around her, the bridge dissolved into ruin. Fire licked up the consoles. Gravity failed as the ship's stabilizers died. The deck seemed to tilt under her boots, and for a moment she floated amid drifting debris, watching her empire fall apart. In that weightless silence, she understood what no Keltari scholar had ever accepted. Humanity's strength was not merely technology or cunning. It was a will that would carry them into extinction before it allowed them to surrender. It was the very thing the Imperium had always believed impossible, that a species could love freedom more than life itself. And as the final rod struck the flagship amidships, splitting it into incandescent fragments, Admiral Zeruth thought, perhaps with a glimmer of admiration, that she had witnessed the only war she would ever lose. In the days that followed, the shattered remains of the Kulturi fleet drifted in a widening halo of wreckage around Earth, a silent testament to a civilization's hubris. No triumphant broadcast was made from humanity's leaders. No celebration echoed across the networks of the surviving colonies. The humans did not seem to relish victory as so many conquerors did. They simply went about the grim work of recovery. On the scorched plains where the hypermass penetrators had launched, the crews gathered amid smoking launch cradles. Most of them were still clad in pressure suits, their faces hidden, but to those watching from orbit, there was no mistaking the way they stood together, unbowed, unafraid. Among the drifting Keltari survivors, cramped in crippled lifeboats and half dead from radiation, that image became legend. It traveled ship to ship, whispered in the flickering glow of failing life support systems. They knew we would force their hand, some said. They were ready to end their own world rather than let us take it. Aboard the remnant of the Varask Ultima, a gutted forward section barely large enough to house the command staff who had survived, Zeruth sat in the gloom with her hands folded across her lap. Her uniform was scorched, the fabric torn where a control panel had exploded. Thin trails of smoke still curled from the edges of the bulkheads. The emergency lighting cast every face in shades of sorrow and disbelief. "They're hailing us," murmured one of the surviving technicians. His voice sounded as though he were reporting a ghost sighting. "Put it through." The screen flickered, lines of static clearing to reveal the human envoy, a woman with iron-gray hair and a lined face that looked as tired as any Zeruth had ever seen. There was no gloating in her eyes, no fury, only a profound weariness. "You have my condolences," the envoy said quietly. Zeruth found her voice, though it felt as though she were speaking from the bottom of a pit. "Condolences? You have no idea what you have done." "I know exactly what we've done," the human sighed. "We defended our home." The technician at Zeruth's side began to protest, but she lifted a hand. "Why?" Zeruth rasped. "Did you never reveal those weapons? We would have respected such power." The envoy shook her head slowly. "You never asked what price. We were willing to pay." The connection severed without further ceremony. For long minutes, no one spoke. The drifting wreck groaned around them like a dying leviathan. At last, Zeruth let her gaze drift out the observation slit to the blue sphere below. In her life, she had overseen so many capitulations. She had watched proud species reduced to clients and vassals. But never had she seen an entire planet of sapients who would rather gamble annihilation than wear her empire's chains. One by one, Keltari lifeboats began their slow crawl away from Earth. They moved like funeral barges, silent and directionless, not a single weapon charged among them. The Imperium had lost more than a battle. It had lost the right to claim universal dominion. Beyond the shattered warships, Earth's orbital platforms flickered with repair crews already at work. Sparks leapt from welding torches as engineers sealed the scars of bombardment. It seemed impossible that so few months before, these people had been dismissed as a backwater curiosity, a civilization still reeling from their first century among the stars. That arrogance had cost the Imperium thousands of ships, the lives of tens of thousands of warriors, and any illusion that humanity could be measured by the metrics of simpler species. In time, news of the defeat would reach the central throne world. Zeruth knew the conclave would convene to decide her fate. She had no illusions about what judgment awaited. Yet in some unaccountable way, she no longer cared. Because she had seen something she would carry to her grave, a truth no other admiral had dared to imagine. It was not simply that humans were clever or resilient or technologically audacious. It was that humans believed to the marrow of their bones that no power in the galaxy was entitled to rule them. Weeks later, in the vast archives of the Imperium, scribes would record the engagement as the Battle of Earth's Perimeter. They would list tonnage lost, strategic objectives unmet, the staggering cost in life and material. But none of those data entries could capture the real wound inflicted that day. It was the wound of knowing that, for all their centuries of conquest, the Kaltari had finally found an adversary who would rather burn the stars to ash than submit. Among the surviving fleet, the Kaltari whispered the same phrase over and over. In awe and in fear, they walked away from the table. They were willing to lose everything. On Earth, as the last Kaltari wreck slipped into the black, humanity did not celebrate. They simply watched. And in the silence of that vigil, the galaxy learned the price of underestimating them. Remember this, the chronicles would later say. When humanity faced annihilation, they did not tremble. The galaxy did.